People who legally died for a few minutes and came back, what was it like? A friend of mine had an overdose, caused a stroke and legally died for a little under 3 minutes in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. He remembers the stroke, and being wheeled to the ambulance on a stretcher. Then he felt like he was floating under ice-cold water, and it was dark, but he wasn't really thinking or feeling anything emotionally, just existing and knowing it was very very cold and he couldn't see. Then he woke up, and the EMTs were kinda freaked out because his heart had stopped long enough that they figured he was done. At some point in the following days he became convinced that what he experienced was hell minus the knowledge of suffering, like a toned-down preview, and thought it was a warning for him to change his life. Sadly, he didn't stay clean for long. Working in a hospital and taking care of people who have been legally dead and have come back either on their own accord or with CPR, I've heard these people say that they felt like they were falling. They also wake up really confused, not remembering the situation. To me it seems like what they experience is close to a dream, that you're falling and wake up with a jolt. Failed suicide attempt. When I was being resuscitated by Dad after he found me hanging, in my dream I woke up in the water. I was looking around and just acknowledged my surroundings. By the time my brain processed where I was, I realized I was drowning. I looked down, it was pitch black, looked up, and swam for my life. It felt like I was running out of oxygen. Just as I hit the top, I woke up and was being put into the ambulance, fell asleep again, then woke up later in ICU. Was 10+ years ago. Hey there. I've actually died twice. Crazy premature birth, heart and lungs didn't work great, and it took a mess of wacky science to bring me back. But I was too young then to remember anything obviously, so that doesn't super count. Second time, I was 19 and got clobbered by a drunk driver. I remember seeing the truck coming up behind me, so I moved to the other side of the road, and then wham! About 2 to 3 seconds of pain and chaos and fear. Apparently I managed to find my phone and one of my shoes, then called for help. My jaw was shattered, but I was just screaming and they GPS'd me, but I have no memory of that. My next memory, after the brief shock of being struck, was the paramedic cutting a trach. You wanna know what that's like? It's like if your sleep paralysis demon finally catches up to you. Then the next memory is waking up a week later, with a half-dozen tubes plugged into me, thrashing and screaming and crying like it had just happened. No biblical dreams, no light at the end of the tunnel. Just chilling to some music on a walk, being flung into a tree, having my throat cut open, waking up a week later in a matter of seconds. 0/10 wouldn't recommend, except I firmly lost any faith I had in an afterlife, and it caused a huge rift in my very religious family. Tell me more about what happens when you die, Mom. I'd love to hear your theories. 28 years ago I was beaten to death by an ex. He had me partially undressed and flat on my back on the sidewalk in front of my apartment. He kept punching me in the face and biting me while yelling at me to shut up. I remember trying to scream for help, but I was swallowing too much of my own blood. I don't remember the police or EMTs showing up. When I was put into the ambulance I wasn't breathing and my heart had stopped. I know the ambulance was yellow because I was looking down at it as if I was sitting in a tree. I wasn't afraid, just curious. I knew I had to get back though because of my young son. The pull to get back to him was very strong. I don't remember anything else. I woke up in the emergency room and the nurses were trying to remove my bra, underwires, and they had the defib, electric paddle thingies, at the ready. Howdy, I died on May 28, 2020 during an emergency procedure on my esophagus. I basically drowned in my own spit and blood while under. I did have something that could have just been my brain doing weird things. I immediately saw myself from the vantage of the room. Everyone but one stepped away and he calmly began performing CPR. I remember knowing that I had the choice to move on or go back, and behind me was a sixth sense of joy, but that could have been my brain. The doctor, who I have not met, walked in and I remember he had a 6 square watch on his wrist, saw what was going on and left. I guess the head nurse guy is known to be good at what he's doing. Oh, and by the way, they didn't use those paddles where they say clear, so I'm wondering if that's just a movie thing. The other nurses were talking and one said he had gout, which is why he had the foot brace thing on, while I saw the flat line from this vantage, it being positioned behind real me. Some other wonky stuff happened. I do remember seeing how frail I was and sort of knowing everyone in the room being good people. Then I was rushing to me, and me threw up a foamy red vomit, and then bam, I was awake with a massive headache and tubes in my throat. They put me under again after a few moments. Later, whenever I woke up in my hospital room, I asked one of the attending nurses to ask the doctor what kind of watch he wore, the square one. She came back and said it was diesel. Then we both realized, I have never seen the doctor. Edit, I coded flatlined. I'm not sure if this meets the definition OP is looking for. I've been pronounced dead twice in my life. The first time, I drowned as a child, about 7 years old. I wanted to see the pool from the high dive. I went up, looked, and slipped when I went to go back down. I remember falling. And then I was surrounded by paramedics and spewing pool water from my lungs while some lady was crossing herself. According to what I've been able to piece together, I was knocked out when I hit the water, and the lifeguard thought I was playing. I drowned while everyone was waiting for me to surface. 911 was called and I was dragged from the water. CPR, before, and from the paramedics didn't work. They were about to cover me up when I started spewing water like a fountain. The second time was at work in my early 20s. I'm an industrial electrician, still to this day. I was working on the controls for a 3-phase/600V air handler's motor. I had turned the circuit off, locked it, and tagged it. Someone cut my lock off and turned it back on without telling anyone. 1 second I'm working on the controls, next second my entire body lights up with pure pain and agony, and then I wake up in the hospital. My boss heard my teeth clack shut when I got hit, and he hit me in the chest with a 2x4 to get me off of it. I didn't have a pulse when EMTs got there, and they got my body rebooted. I woke up in the hospital about 4 hours later. I never saw a light at the end of a tunnel, no lake of fire. Literally nothing. I'll post an update if it happens again. There's an interesting book called Life After Life by a Dr. Moody who became interested in this experience when one of his patients went through it. He did a study, interviewing hundreds of people who had this happen to them. He said that there were a variety of experiences, some not remembering anything, but he listed 7 common ones. Not everyone had all 7, but everyone has some of the 7. Buzzing noise, feeling like they were out of the body, going through a tunnel, meeting former family or friends, meeting a being of light, coming to a boundary where they knew that if they crossed it, they couldn't return. I can't remember the last one. My father actually had a heart attack, and by some miracle he was lucky to get to the hospital in time before it was too late, but in the ambulance he flatlined and they had to revive him, I think twice. Which obviously worked, but it took I think about 4 or 5 minutes, which made everyone worry because his heart wasn't beating, which means he's not getting blood to his brain that will cause brain damage. Long story short, no brain issues and he's completely healthy. I asked about his experience and if he saw some light or anything, but he doesn't remember anything. He almost never remembers his dreams, so even if he did see something, I don't think he'd remember through all of that. LOL. I remember getting in the ambulance and I remember getting out. Was completely unaware that I had arrested until I was told some days later. My dad ended up in the ICU with internal bleeding. All initial attempts to stop the bleeding failed. Apparently died for a couple of men, but they were able to bring him back. He said he remembers walking through an all-gray neighborhood. Gray houses, gray grass, gray streets, everything a different shade of gray. No people or animals around. Empty but not run down or anything like that. He assumed this was the afterlife, so he proceeded to walk around and search for my cousin who recently passed away. He made his way into a house and walked up the stairs. At the top of the stairs a door opened and a bright light shined through. He couldn't see anything because of the light but decided not to walk into it. He stood there on the stairs and asked for more time. The door closed. Doctor was able to stop the bleeding. That was 12 years ago. My dad still has health issues but he got more time like asked for. I have a friend who has died 3 times and been brought back. He says there is just nothing until you wake up in pain and, lot of tubes running into you. It was world of gray and occasional bright color. I was sitting on table and listening to people around me. Their voices were muffled. Then it hit me. I could not move. With corner of my eye I saw a black figure sitting no more than 2 meters from me. I felt fear and could not move. Then I woke up. Eyes full of blood. Sharp pain. Etc. When I was a kid I contracted dengue fever. Major killer of kids my age. So while I was hemorrhaging blood the crackhead doctors told my parents I had to have an appendix removal. They put me under but realized something was wrong when I didn't wake up for 48 hours later. During that time I had a hell of a dream. Was walking on a beach and there was a dude cloaked in black sitting on a bench. Had a nice chat with him before walking up. It was like nothing. I remember pulling out onto the road that I got hit on, then waking up in ICU a few days later. Clinically dead for a minute and a half. Not me but had a friend in high school who died and came back. He swears he went to hell. He was from a very religious family so it might be top of mind. I died illegally and was sent to prison for 3 months. I died during birth for a few minutes. Don't remember it though obviously. Total darkness. Like going to sleep with no dreams. Until you are brought back, then searing pain kicks in. I guess it's BC the body goes out of shock, and you feel everything. That's what it felt like to me. Died on New Year's Day this year from a heroin overdose. Was pleasant, tossed on some tunes went over to the couch to sit down as the shit was coming on then the next thing I knew I was sitting in the back of an ambulance being told I had just died from an overdose. Really it was just like sleeping 1 minute I was there faded out then faded back in don't recall anything in between but I imagine it must have been horrible for my mom to find me that way. So yeah kids don't fun with heroin or opiates in general. Thankfully I'm not addicted to the stuff just occasionally dabbled for many years but after that shit I'm done for good. Heard it from an MBA teacher who went through that. He passed from heart attack for 6 minutes. First he went out of his body and took a while to identify the one body laying dead was his. He listened to all conversations going on between the doctors and attempts to defibrillate him back. He could tell the conversations later and the doctors were shocked. He noticed he was not alone. There was a being of light who told him to be in peace and that his family would be taken care of. No need to worry. He didn't like to hear that too much. Then he was dragged into this tunnel upwards. He then came into a place he could not explain much about but he saw the colors were awesome. Colors he never saw before. Colors we don't see here. In this place, he met someone he didn't want to say much about. This being was big. He then pledged he had to go back to take care of his children and wife. After long whining and negotiating, the being agreed he could go back with 3 conditions. 1. No more corporate stressful job. His children needed him, not his salary. That's when he became a professor and left his VP position at his former company. 2. He would have to tell his experience on the other side to others whenever he got a chance. That's why he took half an hour to tell us his story in his last class to our group. 3. He was not allowed to tell us before it actually happened. He was waiting something to happen. He then told us a crazy time when he was in high danger. Some guy pulled a gun on him and he handled it very well because he knew he couldn't die yet, not before the 3rd point was fulfilled. In fact, the guy pulled the trigger on him, but it failed to shoot. The gun only worked when the guy missed him. Anyways, I believed him and made more questions because I had read a book of 150 cases of near-death experience before, by a doctor who documented it. His points and details all matched with the doctor's book and with many documentaries I was later on. Not very sure why and how, but I know it was true. Not sure if I died, but when I was living with a friend we got into a car accident, with 8 of us in there. I took the worst of it. I smashed into the window, still have scars from it. I did not have a belt on, was not required for a passenger to have a belt on at the time. I slumped over, I could not feel anything, could not say anything. I could still hear everyone's calling my name, but that slowly faded away. I woke up being pushed into an ambulance. This was about 15 minutes later, as they are sticking that long plastic tube to open for airway, forgot the device's name. The good news was that I was alive, spent a little over a week in the hospital. I was internally bruised, took about 5 months for me to heal. I felt bad for my mother, she was unaware of anything because we didn't live together. She decided to drop by my friend's house and she was pissed that nobody notified her of the accident. This is a whole different story. Not me, but my father told me he had died in surgery. No dreams, no afterlife, no nothing. I had a heart attack while on a run. Dropped dead and bounced off the ground. Cardiologists are sure my heart stopped for about 30 seconds. I snapped back to when the guys started calling my name. It wasn't a Fred Sanford, it's the big one, Elizabeth event. Didn't see any light or myself, it was like a surreal dream without anything remarkable. Got up and walked the last 50 feet, 15 meters, to cross the finish line. Did damage to the heart, received multiple stents, in the hospital for 4 days and was 50 years old. Moral of the story, listen to your body. My mother was dead for over 20 minutes. She said she saw nothing, felt nothing. She only knew she'd been dead when she was brought round by the medics in the hospital. As she is a very religious lady, it knocked her religious belief for many years. She now thinks she wasn't supposed to see anything, as she feels she would have wanted to stay with those she would have seen, like her mother, etc. My OB made a medical error during birth, and I hemorrhaged, coded, died, and was revived in an emergency surgery. I saw my late dad, who sent me back. I, then 29, female, hemorrhaged, coded, died, and was revived after giving birth to my first son. I had a mandated C-section, was not allowed to even attempt vaginal birth due to musculoskeletal disease, and when I was in recovery, I started feeling gushes of blood. I told my nurse, but she told me that I didn't know what I was talking about, because it's your first baby. A few minutes go by and I started feeling weak, and strangely calm. I told my husband I loved him and thought I was dying. He ran for a nurse, who came in and peeked under my sheets to find a puddle of blood. She pulled the all-call code, and I was suddenly being rushed back to the operating theater for an emergency laparotomy. I remember being told to say goodbye to my husband and new baby because I may not make it. My nurse crying, the angry beep of machines. Then all the light and sound were being sucked out of the room like a vacuum. Then nothingness. I woke up in a foggy place, but the sun or light source was shining somehow. It was a complete contradiction, but I accepted it. It was the most perfect temperature. And then I saw my late daddy. I was a daddy's girl through and through, and I was by his bedside when he took his last breath at 52. I rushed to him and we sat on a classic park bench. I could feel that we weren't alone, but not in a creepy way. I just couldn't see them, only my daddy. Dressed in his favorite flannel and jeans, restored to health, how he looked in his prime before cancer ravaged him. I told him how I wanted to stay with him because I missed him, and I felt no pain here. There is not a waking moment I am not in pain due to my condition. He told me that he knew my wings weren't ready, and that I had to go back to take care of my boys. That my husband needed me for our boys. We shared all this without speaking a single word, it was just an instant understanding. He promised he would always be with me in my most difficult times, and he has. I leaned over to put my head on his shoulder, and I woke up a day and a half later in the ICU, Was there 5 days. I lost 40% of my blood. I don't remember most of my baby's birth, and traumatized my husband so badly he didn't want to try for more kids for years. And they poorly matched my blood for transfusions and I ended up Kel positive, but that's another story for another time. It was dark and gradually I can hear voices of people surrounding me, then I woke up. I watched my mom die from acute pulmonary edema. She looked me straight in the eye seconds before and said, "I'm not afraid." She says she's glad to see me. She was revived and had no memory of what she saw, unfortunately. She passed away a year later.